students. We are going to start talking about World War I today. Whenever I talk about World War I always talk about the European powder keg. If you don't know what a powder keg is, right, if you think about like a Tom and Jerry cartoon and you think about when Tom is going to blow something up and he's got this big, right, keg of powder and he's running around with it, always has a hole, and, it's putting gunpowder all over, and then they light the match and it blows up Tom and his friends, right? That's a powder keg. And when we think about a powder keg, we think about what ignites a powder keg. So there's really two things I want you to understand here when we talk about what caused World War I. If someone were to ask you what caused World War I, what would you answer? Some of you might know something about World War I, or be perhaps even World War I buffs. There are more of those than there ever have been before. A big movie that was out a couple of months ago on World War I, some mini series on World War I. Anybody know what they would answer if they were asked what started World War I? Okay, I'm going to trust that you answered something. And some of you might have said the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. And if you said that, you are correct. Some of you maybe didn't say that. Some of you maybe said entangling alliances throughout Europe. That's also a correct answer. If you think about entangling alliances as the powder keg, you can think about the assassination of the Archduke of Austria as the spark that exploded that powder keg. So it's important to understand that without the powder keg, that assassination of an Austrian Archduke may not have started the war. Now, depending on what type of history you're reading, some people would say that the war was a fait accompli. It was already going to happen. It was just a matter of time. But certainly we can answer correctly that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand set this war off. So before I always talk about World War I at this point, I always just do a quick review of what's going on. This should be very familiar to us from our nationalism chapter and our expansionism chapter, but just very quickly, we remember that Austria, let's put Austria in the negative, right? Austria has been struggling. They lost the Austro-Prussian War to the Prussians in 1866. They have had to make a lot of concessions to the Hungarians that live within Austria. They are not exactly a power on the rise, although they're still powerful. So we would say Austria is struggling. And again, I hope you remember one of the main things that they're struggling with. We'll review that in just a moment. Britain is doing pretty well. They are building their world empire. So what I want you to remember about Britain is that they've successfully had a lot of reform. They've expanded the vote, although not universally, but they've expanded the vote. Their people are generally happy, although there is some protest. That's allowed in a country with basic human rights. It's the classical liberal ideal nation. And it has been building an overseas empire, right, on which the sun never sets. So Britain, I would say, is on the plus side. It's a rising power. What about the Russians? Well, they're still struggling. A lot of the reforms that they did have been halfway measures. They've lost, remember the Russo-Japanese War. They've had the Bloody Sunday Revolution. Their people are unhappy. They're still quite backward. They have had some reform, but maybe it isn't at the point where it needs to be. And so Russia is going to have a hard time if it has to enter a world war like it's going to right now. Belgians, we haven't really said a whole lot about the Belgians. Let's just say that they are a neutral country and that they have signed what's called a neutrality agreement to protect them. In 1889, Belgium, noticing all the alliances happening in Europe, said, well, we better get behind somebody. And so many countries signed a neutrality agreement with Belgium that agreed that Belgian neutrality would be respected. Think of where Belgium is on the map. You map quiz people, right? It's important that their neutrality be respected because they are a country right in the midst of other very powerful countries. And so Belgium is doing okay. They have a neutrality treaty that's been signed by all the countries that we're going to be talking about in 1889, and we'll see how that goes for them when we get to our next lecture. Or actually, it'll actually come up in this lecture. What about Germany? Well, I'd say Germany is still definitely on the plus side. They're united, they're building, they are kicking off still results of the Industrial Revolution. They're a power that's increasing. They even have a couple of colonies overseas. And so Germany's a plus side power. The Ottoman Empire, they're struggling. We're going to nickname them the sick man of Europe. We'll talk about that in a few seconds. But the Ottoman Empire is a declining power. And that's resulting in a place called the Balkans. The Balkans are a result of the breakaway nations from the Ottoman Empire. Now let's put a question mark, because depending on which of the Balkan nations you're in, you could be doing well or not so well. You have broken off and you are an independent nation. You're no longer under the domination of the Ottoman Turks, but who is in charge of you? That's a big question, and that's one of the big questions that we're going to ask today. And we're going to talk about some wars that the Balkan nations have been involved in that predate World War I. The U.S. is doing pretty well. They are on the plus side, certainly as a nation, growing in power. But the U.S. likes their sweet isolation. The U.S. likes to be, we're going to draw some water here. Oh, that's supposed to be blue. We're going to draw some water here, and they like to be on their side of the ocean, all right? They like to be away from Europe and Europe's problems and wars that Europe is going to get into. And they like their isolation. And remember, they have their own version of expansion. They are interested in South America, Central America. They're interested in their Pacific side entities that they've gotten from the West and the world type expansion. They're interested in Guam. They're interested in Midway. They're interested in Hawaii. They're interested in dealing with their issues in the Philippines. They are not interested in getting involved in European wars, and we're going to see that more as we go. And then Italy, right? We said Italy is united. Okay, they've been united now since 1870, but they are struggling. Their country is united, but perhaps some of the people in southern Italy don't feel like they've gotten the full promise of unity. Some of the people in northern Italy wish that it was more modern than it already is, more industrialized than it already is. And so what we're going to end up with is a Europe that's charged for expansion, for continuing friendships on some side, and for cooling of friendships on the other side. And we noticed that Europe has been shoring up allies all this time. During this time, various nations have made promises to the other to be on their side should a war begin. And a lot of these alliances had conditions, very specific conditions, and we're going to be talking about each one of those as we go today. So there's a great link that I put already in Google Classroom, and the link is from a website called Vox, and they have a little thing that they put together called 40 Maps that explain World War I. In no way are you required to look at these, but I did link them and thought that some of you might be interested in these 40 different maps. I just copied a few of them and stuck them in here. We're not going to talk about them in detail, but how do these maps explain World War I? Well, this, first of all, is showing you what became Germany, right? There's our old friend from 2 weeks ago, Schleswig-Holstein. Remember when that had to become of Germany? Here is Brandenburg, Prussia, and the connection between the old Sentinel on the Rhine right here, right, and modern day Germany. Here are the southern German provinces that have been engrafted in as a result of the Franco-Prussian War. And so we see that one map that helps explain World War I is a new, powerful, and much more united Germany. And Germany still had some things to work out, but they really represent a serious block of power now. Oh, there's our friend Belgium that we were talking about. That is going to kind of be right in the middle of Germany and their enemy, France. Remember the whole thing with Alsace-Lorraine and the end of the Franco-Prussian War. That is not so good, right? And so that's certainly a map that helps explain World War I. Another map that can help explain World War I is this one. You don't really think about the West and the World chapter that we just studied having to do with World War I, but one thing that you're going to understand is that some of these countries weren't just bringing themselves into the war, but they were bringing the rest of the world into the war because of all of the territory that they now owned. Something we did not get to talk about last week, you saw it a little bit on that Scramble for Africa video. If you want to look at France, right, they kind of ended up with an attempt, and this didn't work perfectly, but the French started kind of working out an attempt to try to conquer land from west to east. You can see that big tract called French West Africa, and they were kind of moving their way, all right, from west to east across Africa in an attempt to dominate it. Britain, on the other hand, let's make Britain blue. Britain, on the other hand, they were working on, remember their involvement in Egypt, a belt of land that worked south to north. You can see British Africa and then all the way down to South Africa. Now, of course, the Dutch, right? Let's make the Dutch yellow. The Dutch were in here, in the Transvaal. Remember that? And they had moved inward. So this is not perfect, okay? But here's what the British wanted: a north to south belt of dominant land in the Scramble for Africa. And the French wanted that same thing, west to east. Of course, the place where they then naturally had conflict was in the Sudan. And someday when you study colonialism, I hope you'll get to study a little bit more of that. But certainly there had already been some tensions between nations. France and Britain worked their tensions out and basically said, hey, we'll let you control and dominate your area unchallenged if you let us control and dominate our area unchallenged. And they didn't make life too easy on the rest of the countries that wanted a piece of Africa. And so certainly there were tensions, but some of those tensions were worked out. Some of those tensions were aggravated. But when you think about the world and the colonialism that's happening during the world, when a war breaks out, it's not just going to be continental Europe. It's going to involve almost the entire known world at the time. Here's a last map of the 40 maps that Vox put together to explain World War I. Some of them are more like diagrams and illustrations than they are maps, but this one, of course, is famous. One of the reasons I want to show you these is because we've looked at all these before, and I want you to see that you're getting a very good background and understanding of what we're talking about here. So here, we're looking at, of course, that ethnic group situation of Austria, right? We've got the Hungarian Magyars in the green. We've got our Germans in the pink, and all of these other groups and countries. And here, down here, we have Croatians, Bosnians, Serbs, okay? And then we have Serbia that is part Balkanized and is kind of an independent area now. That's going to cause some stuff here in World War I. So we have all kinds of people. A lot of people in this area of Austria will be Slavic peoples, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But those are some really good maps, 40 maps that explain World War I. It's linked in Google Classroom if you want to go and take a look at those sometime during the week and have a little fun with the different type of maps. Some of them get really into the military aspect of World War I as far as the specific battles and specific attack strategy, military strategy, even weapons strategy. We will not be able to do that in World War I for this class. We're going to run out of time, and that's never really the goal, is for our class to be a military history class. But I got to tell you, if some of you are interested in this stuff and you major in history or you have some electives free to you, that's what taking classes like this is about. Taking a class like this and getting AP European History credit is so that you don't have to go and take your Western Civ or your European History requirement at college. It's so that you can look through the catalog, okay, and you can find a class on World War I military history, or World War I great generals, or World War II air attacks, or something very, very specific, the Renaissance, specifics on the Reformation. And so if you end up being a World War I buff, congratulations, that's awesome. Use these maps to help you. There's lots of resources, and think about the time that you can take your next class that gets into a little bit more detail. We're, of course, still in a survey course. So I'm going to keep going here, and we're going to talk about how the world is really lining up. So it seems like every country has kind of been concentrated on their own stuff. Internally, working out being a nation, and that sometimes means fighting other nations. But even when you're fighting other nations, think about, 1 minute. Sorry, guys, had to yawn there. Think about Germany when the Prussians are getting involved with wars with Austria, for instance. Their main goal is to just unify Prussia, knock Austria out of contention for being a rival power to them, and then move on. They're not looking to build world empires quite yet. That does happen with the rest of the world in the overseas dealings of these countries, but for the most part, they're kind of maintaining their independence. Slowly but surely, you're going to start to see these countries kind of come together, though, and to kind of align themselves with each other. So let's talk about what caused unity between the Russians, okay? Because you might ask, well, why are these guys together? The Russians, the French, and the British. What's causing them to form what we call the Triple Entente? Sometimes we always talk about the Axis and the Allies. Let's talk about that in World War II. Okay, our powers here are going to be the Triple Entente and the Central Powers. So what's causing these guys to have some camaraderie and some alliances? Well, first of all, France has a major enemy, and that enemy is Germany. Okay, they're angry at the Germans for the Franco-Prussian War. They're angry at the Germans for the loss of territory in Alsace-Lorraine. They're angry at the Germans for the whole humiliation of Paris throughout 1871. They have a burning hatred for the Germans. And so as the French are out there looking for an ally, they, of course, want someone to side with them against the Germans. They look toward Britain to do that, but Britain is kind of like, we don't really like to talk too much about who we hate. We're in our splendid isolation out here. We don't necessarily have a problem with Germany like you do. We are trade partners with Germany, and so we like you, France, but we don't like you enough to have this very, very clear relationship against the Germans. The Russians, on the other hand, they need a buddy, all right? The Russians are not one of the strongest powers, and the Russians and French, they do have good relationships with each other, and Russia's need for an ally kind of pushes them toward France. Now, how does Britain get involved in the Triple Entente? Well, that has to do with the invasion of Belgium. All of these nations had signed a neutrality agreement for neutral Belgium in 1889, saying that they would respect its borders. Really, the thing that caused the British to come out and straight out align themselves with the Russians and the French was when Germany attacked France by marching through Belgium. And then Britain couldn't put up with it anymore. They were willing to put up with so much before entering World War I, but they protested when Belgium's neutrality was violated, and Germany's response was, we see Belgium's neutrality as a scrap of paper. It's nothing more than a scrap of paper. Well, when Germany said that, Britain felt that they had no choice. And so that's a quick history of how the Russians, the French, and the British kind of joined together. What about the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians? Well, if you want to think of it this way, and the Ottomans, these are more second-rate and rising powers. Now, certainly Germany is the leader, okay? But the Austro-Hungarians, they're struggling. They are afraid of losing territory, and they're definitely afraid of the balkanization of their territory into various ethnic groups because of our famous Austria map, okay? They're very worried about that. The Turks are the ones losing that territory. They're losing control of what they used to hold on to control here in the Ottoman Empire and in their dominance. And the Austrians are also shedding. So between these two nations, they certainly have something in common. Germany, rejected by the French and the Russians, okay, would love to be allies with England, but that's not necessarily going to happen. And so that means that Germany is going to find stronger allies with the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottoman Turks. And so we end up with the Triple Entente and the Central Powers when it comes to the war. But there were all kinds of alliances that these countries had made with each other to support each other in both trade, in international relations, and in the rest of the world. Okay, this is another map from the map of 40 maps that explain World War I. What we're interested in looking at this map is you can see that it focuses in on what's left of the Ottoman Empire here in Turkey, okay, and Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia. Okay, you can see these areas here. And what this map on the 40 maps, a little thing that they put together, a little slideshow, is called Two Wars That Failed to Settle Rival Blocs. Well, take a look at this. Before there was World War I, there were the Balkan Wars. These are some of the most difficult wars to understand in all of the history that I have studied personally. The Balkan Wars, in fact, you guys know that I write those little books. I've probably written about 25 of them. When they gave me the assignment to write on the first two Balkan Wars, Balkan War I and II, that's what made me give up writing those works, because the time investment to understand the Balkan Wars and to read the literature, much of which is in foreign languages on the Balkan War, and even the documentaries that are available on the Balkan Wars have to be translated. Very, very difficult wars to understand and very complex. Nonetheless, if you want to think of, and I'm going to take myself off of here for a second, think of the Third Balkan War as World War I. Okay, that's a good way to understand what the Balkan Wars were. They are a series of wars based on ethnicities, borders, okay? And the Third Balkan War, because they can't get anything settled, ends up escalating into what we call World War I. So in the First Balkan War, you have Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria fighting in the area of Macedonia, fighting the Ottoman Empire and taking away a lot of the Ottomans' territory in Macedonia. Remember, when you do the map, how Turkey spills over onto the continent, right? And so Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria, they were all interested in independence. They were interested in not being part of, and their territory becoming free. Now, Greece had won its independence from the Turks way back in 1821, okay? But they're helping the Serbians and the Bulgarians in the First Balkan War. And they win against the Ottoman Empire because the Ottoman Empire is not in a position of strength anymore. But the First Balkan War actually causes the Second Balkan War, because Serbia and Bulgaria, as soon as the First Balkan War is over, they start fighting over the territory. It's like they fought together, but now they can't decide what belongs to whom, what ethnic groups should be aligned with what. They're having the same problem the Austrians are having, except with each other now. And Austria feels like it needs to get involved, because remember what Austria wants, right? Austria wants peace. Austria wants the status quo. They can't afford hot wars near their borders because of their particular ethnic situation. And so Austria intervenes in the Second Balkan War, trying to settle a war dispute between Serbia and Bulgaria left over from the First Balkan War. Well, that caused a lot of anti-Austrian sentiment in Serbia. The Serbians did not like the Austrians, okay? And there are several reasons why. Number one, the Serbians wanted to create what's called a pan-Serbian nation, okay? So a pan-Slavic nation, if you will. So let's take a quick look and let's talk about what's going on. First of all, the Ottoman Empire had been slowly dying. And so as this Ottoman Empire is dying, I like this illustration of the sick man of Europe. If you can imagine, right, a person that's lying in a bed, and I want you to imagine this Ottoman Empire as a person, and they're holding on to all of their territories and all of their areas that they control very tightly. But the sicker that they get, right, they can't hold on to this anymore, and their hands start to loosen their grip and control, and it's barely enough for them to do to just stay alive. Here we have the Ottoman Turks, right, looking pretty despondent as the members of the other nations begin to pull apart the map of what the Ottoman Turks used to dominate and control. And so we have these Austrians and these Germans, and they're pulling back on this map and saying, well, we'll take this and we'll take this and we'll take this. As you lose control of your areas, we'll be happy to take them from you, Austria. And so what you end up having is a Ottoman Empire that is losing and losing control fast. And so Serbia hopes that what this means is that these nations, these areas, that are being freed from Turkish control can find independence, and maybe they'll even gather together in a pan-Slavic nation throughout Europe. Now, what do we mean by Slavic? Okay, it's S-L-A-V. Okay, the Slavs. And the Slavs are basically the people who you would think of as ethnically like the Russians. Okay, the Slavic people are more like your Russian people. So if you want to think about the British largely being Anglo-Saxons, if you want to think about the French originally being these Frankish people, if you want to think about the Germans being Teutonic peoples, all right, and that would include a lot of people in Austria. Think about the Russian people or the Eastern Europeans being Slavic. And so since many of these nations that were coming out from under the dominance of the Turks were Slavic peoples, Serbia had a lot of very pro-Slavic nationalism, and they believed that the Slavs were their time to shine. And so maybe they'd be able to create a pan-Slavic nation that would be really powerful. And of course, probably that Serbia could dominate. So that was their hope. And that meant that the Serbians didn't like at all the idea that the Austrians would try to use their power to come in and control whatever the Ottoman Turks are letting go. Now let's just think of both sides for a second. If you're a Serbian, it makes sense that you want this to be an independent nation just like you, or even better, to join with you in a pan-Slavic, stronger nation in Europe. But if you're Austrian, the last thing you want is ethnic nationalism. And so you want to quickly snap up, walk into that vacuum of power, and to start taking these territories, whether they're Slavic or not is not the point. You want to start taking them and saying, these are Austrian. Austria will control these. Austria will handle these. And adding to Austria's territory, but also avoiding ethnic ethnocentrism that can cause the Austrian territories that are already within Austria to have nationalistic revolutions. We know they don't want that. So the sick man of Europe is really causing some problems here, all right? Now, in the midst of all this, Austria decides that it is going to flex its muscle a bit and that it's going to show the areas that are falling apart here, that Austria is a great nation to befriend, Austria is a great neighbor, Austria is a great area of the world to align yourself with. And so they send two goodwill ambassadors from Serbia, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, from Austria down into Sarajevo. And what they hope to accomplish there is it's like a goodwill mission for Austria. They're going to have a visit with important people. They're going to show themselves in the street. They're going to rouse the feeling of Austrian nationalism and the idea that, oh yes, we're linked to a very important European power and we have the chance to do this, and we're no longer going to be under the control of the Ottoman Turks, and we don't really want to be independent. We want to be Austrian. And the Serbians, not so much the country of Serbia, but the Serbian people, and especially the Serbian nationalists, they have their own ideas. This is where, if you're familiar with this from your U.S. history class, the Black Hand, the Serbian nationalist or terrorist movement, and a man named Gavrilo Princip, depending on what video you're watching, it comes into play. Because the Archduke and his wife are going to get assassinated, and this is going to be the thing that kicks off the powder keg of World War I. So go ahead and pause the video and watch this quick 4 or 5 minute video on the assassination of the Archduke to help you understand exactly what happened in starting off World War I. Okay, so you should have watched that World War I video and understood that that caused quite an embarrassment and a problem for the Austrians. The Austrians lost face with this, okay? They had their Archduke and his wife killed right in the middle of their show of power. This is very bad for Austria, okay? They've got to save face here. And they demand that Serbia take blame, okay? And they demand that Serbia say, yes, we're sorry that this happened and this never should have happened. But Serbia refuses to do this. They say this wasn't even us. This was a terrorist group. And if you hadn't been down here to begin with, then maybe that wouldn't have happened. And Serbia refuses to take all of the blame over this. And they do say, yes, we are sorry this happened, but the Austrians want a little bit more, and there's kind of an all or nothing type fight here. So Austria does not really know what to do because they feel that for the sake of unity of their own country, and that's why we have our famous map running in the back here with our Germans, our Magyars, our Armenians, our Croats, our Serbians, our Romanians, our Czechs, our Slovaks, our Poles, our Slovenians, and our Russians, right? When we have, and our Italians, when we have this map running in the back, we remember that the Austrians have got to make this work. Okay, they have to show that Serbia is going to bow the knee and say that they're sorry to this major nation state. You can't have Serbians just assassinating the government officials of these major European powers. I mean, look, Austria was sitting down at the concert of Europe in 1815. They certainly can't allow terrorists to take pot shots at their, official carriages in foreign areas. And so the Austrians, they say, we want this, and the Serbs refuse to come fully into what they want. Now, very, very important. One of the most important things you're going to understand in this whole lecture. Austria doesn't quite know what to do, so they go to one of their allies. And that ally is one of their allies from the Central Powers, what will become the Central Powers. They go to the Germans, and they ask the Germans for advice. Very important. Germany, what do you think we need to do about how do you think we need to handle this Serbian situation? Do we have your blessing? Do you think that we need to declare war on Serbia for what has happened here? Germany does something very, very, very important here. And this is referred to in history as the blank check. Make sure you write that down. The blank check. Germany says to Austria, in a sense, you do what you have to do to maintain your sovereignty, your borders, and your respect from amongst the people and the rest of the countries in the world. So do what it is that you have to do. This is called the blank check. It's like saying to Austria, you write it. You write the check, right? That's what a blank check is. Somebody hands you a blank check, they're saying, write it for the amount that you want to. That's how people saw Germany's action, as a blank check to Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary does declare war on Serbia on the 28th of July, 1914. Now, that does not seem like that big of a deal. Austria-Hungary should have been able to declare war on Serbia, and they should not have had to have too hard of a time in defeating the Serbians. However, this is a time of nationalism. This is a time of a lot of strain. This is a time where countries have a lot of entangling alliances, and there's a powder keg happening in Europe. And so when Serbia declares war against Austria-Hungary in response, we're going to end up with a problem. Now, remember our friends, the Russians? They're a Slavic people. And Russia has been trying to create a unity. Russia is making an appeal to its own country to develop, to grow, to come into modern times. And a lot of that is based on Slavic nationalism. See, we're no longer in Russia serfs and an aristocratic class and czars. We're having a Russian Duma. We're getting more representative. We've freed the serfs. I'm not trying to make Russia out into some modern country, but that's where they want to head. And they're using Slavic nationalism to get there. Now, the problem is for Russia that there are other Slavs in Europe. And somebody who's really into their Slavicness are the Serbians. And the Serbians are calling out to their brothers in Russia and saying, brothers in Russia are Slavic brothers and sisters. We are being attacked by these Teutonic Austrians, and all the Slavic peoples have been held under domination by either the Turks or by the Germanic peoples for so long. Will you come to our aid? Will you come to our, we're just sitting here. We had nothing to do with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. And now Austria is at our borders and they're going to try to compel us. And they're just using an excuse to gather up and to gobble up this territory that's being lost by the Ottoman Turks. What is Russia going to do? Russia can't say, oh no, that Slavic thing, that's just words for like inside national unity. They have to respond to the Slavic call for brotherhood, but they don't want to declare war against the Austro-Hungarians. They know that that means the same thing as declaring a war against the Germans, and they don't want a war. They're working on modernization. The problem is that because of the size, the vastness, the lack of transportation, the lack of modernization, and the lack of communication in Russia, their mobilization plans, mobilization meaning, again, get ready for war, they take 6 weeks. In order for Russia to prepare itself to enter into war of any kind of large scale, they are going to need 6 weeks worth of preparation, and they can't afford not to start their mobilization process. And so they do this. They start to mobilize for war in response to Serbia. Now, this is something very important. Russia does not declare war. Russia starts mobilizing for war in response to the calls of the Serbians that they are being violated by one of the other powers and that this is a totally defensive situation. We did nothing, and now the Austro-Hungarians have made all these demands. We tried to be reasonable. We tried to give them what they want. Now they're massing on our borders. They've declared war. Please, Russia, come and help us. Russia mobilizes, but they stop short of declaring war, mobilizing and bringing their armies to the border. Now, my map people, right? Think about the borders of Russia and where they end up. And there's a country that says, oh no, mobilization is an act of war. Mobilization is an act of war, and that country is Germany. Germany is, first of all, allied to Austria-Hungary, and they're watching this situation, but they don't trust what's happening with the Russians, especially because on the one side, they've got Russia, and on the other side, they have Russia's new friend, the French. And the Germans do not want to fight a two-front war. When they see the Russians start to mobilize, they say to themselves, oh, no, 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 no. They don't get to just say, oh, we're not coming to war, we're only mobilizing for war. No, mobilization is an act of war against Austria-Hungary. And so therefore, the Germans say, you are the aggressor in this. Austria-Hungary hasn't done anything to you. They haven't declared war against you. And so if you mobilize, you are declaring war against them, which means that you are the ones on the offensive. And so therefore, we will declare war on you. Austria-Hungary and Germany declares war on Russia on the 1st of August. So you can see that this is happening rapidly. This is within days, guys, that this powder keg is exploding. So now we have the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians having declared war on both the Serbs and on the Russians. And likewise, these nations are all going to declare war on each other. Well, we've already said, once you bring in the Russians, you're going to have to bring in the French. The French were bound by treaty to Russia, and that meant that they were going to have to enter this war against Germany. Well, they hated Germany, so that wasn't too much of a problem. And if you fight a war against Germany, you're going to fight a war against their allies in Austria-Hungary. And so the French declare war on Germany and Austria-Hungary on the 3rd of August. Again, happening very, very, very rapidly. Now, we're going to talk about this more in the next lecture, but Germany had a plan. This plan had a specific name. It's called the Schlieffen Plan. And they said, if we ever get involved in a war where the Russians and French are on two sides, we could lose, because we don't want to fight this two-front war against two powerful nations that are surrounding us. And so their first point was that if a war ever starts, what we've got to do is we've got to get into France and we got to knock out Paris fast. Remember how the Germans got bogged down in Paris in 1871 and it took them almost a whole year to defeat the French? Well, they said, if we could just get to Paris and knock it out like that, and not waste our time. That's a great strategy for future wars. And so when the war was declared, Germany very quickly went to Paris, and they said, "We'll knock Paris out, and if we have to fight the Russians, no problem. It takes them 6 weeks to mobilize." You understand? You understand the timeline? Remember, we're only like 3 days into this situation, so the Russians, they're not prepared to fight still. We have time in Germany's mind to get into France, take Paris, but the way they thought they were going to do that was through Belgium. And the problem is Belgium had that neutrality treaty that everyone had signed back in 1889. The Germans didn't really care about the neutrality treaty because they needed the Schlieffen Plan to work. But there was someone who did care. The British, okay? And we're going to talk about the British in a minute, but I want to throw in the United States here. No, let's go to Britain, okay? So Britain declared war against Germany on the 4th of August, right? Her reason for entering the conflict was because she was obligated to by this 75-year-old treaty that had been signed by the Belgians. You know, I think I keep saying 1889, but I think it is 1839. I think it's 1839 that we're talking about. I'll have to look it up. I had a slide, and I don't know what happened to it. Anyway, when the British saw that, they reluctantly declared war against the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. They did not want to, but they felt that they had to. If countries were just going to start violating treaties, that meant that they could violate any treaty they wanted. And so they came in on behalf of the Belgians. They really came in because they thought that these nations were not acting correctly. And acting as they had promised that they would in previous treaties. So very quickly, now Britain comes to the war. It's important to note, though, here that Britain's entry into the war brings in her colonies and her dominions abroad, which for Britain are very big: Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, all those countries in South Africa. There's a lot of people that now come to the fight with Britain. Other nations also brought their colonial empires, but certainly Britain's was the biggest and most impressive. And it brought many, many soldiers from around the globe that were fighting underneath the British flag as parts of the British Empire into what will become World War I. Okay, I kind of went past the U.S., so maybe we'll add that to the next lecture. Essentially, the U.S. is going to try to remain neutral, but it's only going to work for them until about 1917. Let's keep going. What about Japan? Remember, Japan has been kind of growing and trying to make a name for itself. It's fought the Russians. It's taking territory. Well, Japan had a military agreement with Britain, and so therefore they declared war about a month later, 23rd of August, 1914. And of course, all the other things, Austria-Hungary says, well, if you declare war on Germany, then you declare war on us, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see how all these countries are coming together to be embroiled in World War I. So now we have the Japanese involved. Lastly, we're going to talk about Italy. Italy was allied formally to both Germany and Austria, but they basically said, we don't really think that the way that Germany and Austria-Hungary came into the war was it is in the written form of our agreement. The way that they came into the war was a bit aggressive for us, and we only agreed to come into this if they were fighting a defensive war. Now, certainly Austria-Hungary would say, well, we were fighting a defensive war against the Serbians. They killed our guy, right? The Germans would say, we were fighting a defensive war. We were fighting against the Russians who were mobilizing. But Italy said, no, we think your actions are more on the offensive side. And thus, Italy felt that they could stay out of the war and follow a policy of neutrality. It wasn't until 1915 that Italy did come into the war, and when Italy did come into the war, they signed with the Allied side, not with the Germans and Austro-Hungarians who they were originally allied to. So that's pretty important to understand that after 1915, Italy will become part of the forces with the Russians, the French, the British, and eventually the United States. Right now, the United States is interested in their splendid isolation. If you remember your U.S. history, you might remember Woodrow Wilson and his famous slogan of getting reelected. He kept us out of war. It actually wasn't his slogan. I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow as we get into the actual war being fought. I hope that helps you to understand the different countries coming into World War I and how World War I really got started in Europe. And I'm going to ask you to take a short quiz on this. That'll just be a Google quiz, about 10-question quiz after every lecture this week. Make sure you take it. All right, guys, I shall see you tomorrow or whenever you watch the next video that talks about World War I itself. Bye-bye.